I see. Yes, that makes sense. How did it actually happen with Jesus exactly at that time?
You mean how it all began and developed? His human supporters on earth first watched Jesus of Nazareth in amazement, were surprised by some of his physical abilities, trained him, and some actually believed that he could be the longed-for Savior. They finally believed that they could establish him as the Messiah, as was generally believed by the people. In order for Jesus' supporters to accomplish the feat of placing this man from Nazareth on this very Son God throne, however, it was necessary to retrospectively present him with the Son cult and valid Redeemer elements that should have taken place at birth and during childhood. This was done by oral tradition after his crucifixion, and later it was recorded in writing in the Gospels. The other miracles that the Son of God or the Messiah had to perform during his adult life were indeed performed by Jesus of Nazareth, so that these could be seen and experienced, so that the people who had been religiously imbued with the cult of the Son and the Redeemer could accept Jesus of Nazareth as sent by God. And then of course there were also those preceding signs. Obviously, Jesus of Nazareth was not born of a virgin. He was not born on December 25th. He did not ascend into the so-called heaven, and at his birth no star in the east appeared in the sky or 3 kings came to pay homage to the light of the world. Nor did he teach in the temple at the age of 12. Nobody even knows exactly when he was born. And he died like all other people, but only long after the allegedly fatal crucifixion. But he will never come back as he was. That is not possible. I personally put my seal and letter on it. That is again only part of the old Son cult myth, which always directed and manipulated people.
I see.
At some point in his life, Jesus of Nazareth also knew intuitively what his role was, to do exactly what he did in the end. He and his followers did all the things necessary to fulfill the Son cult Redeemer myth. He healed, roamed around with his so-called disciples, taught, did miracles, and then finally planned the coup with these disciples and a few more supporters to credibly betray him, only to apparently die on the cross by using his amazing body control, which impressed the resistance, to lower his heartbeat to be considered dead and then be buried for 3 days. Then to come back to life. But he himself secretly had the idea that he might actually die. At first only because he had doubts about his role as Messiah, but then also because he suddenly knew that he was not the Messiah, could not be. Because he learned that the Redeemer was merely a means of controlling people, and that he would not do the resistance and freedom movement any good in the long run. He could even destroy it. Then he would rather really die on the cross. But then the staged betrayal of the resistance movement suddenly backfired, because someone from his own ranks actually committed treason and wanted to hand Jesus over. But before the betrayal could be fully implemented, the traitor suffered death. He was killed. The Nazarene was saved at first, but Jesus then voluntarily accepted that fate, surrendered, because he knew that the Redeemer myth was a controlling element, and because he believed that the militant part of the freedom movement would be preserved if he surrendered to the fate of dying on the cross. At the crucifixion he then slowed down his heartbeat and restricted further bodily functions, but it happened anyway. He died, but was only dead for a short time, then, with the help of the Master AI, came back to life immediately, remained in a kind of rigor mortis in front of the eyes of the people, and was then buried for 3 days. Due to his hanging position on the cross and the weakening of his body, his breathing eventually stopped working. His body control, which he applied in spite of his decision to commit suicide, was of little use. Jesus of Nazareth suffocated agonizingly. The AI delayed this, and let him die exactly when they were about to check if he was dead. The AI finally prevented him from hanging on the cross for any longer immediately after his death, so that he only had to be dead for a few minutes, so that the AI could revive him after removing him from the cross and keep him in rigor. When people examined or looked at him afterwards, his body was put back into rigidity and his breathing and heartbeat flattened. When he was buried, his supporters were desperate and stunned by the apparent death. The coup had gone wrong. But then he was back, miraculously. From then on, the veneration of this man was fixed. Even nobility and club were unsettled. Additionally unsettled by an inexplicable circumstance, when they wanted to kill Jesus of Nazareth afterwards, and then they were eliminated as if by a supernatural influence, the master AI. The story about this actual resurrection has been told. Then the resurrected Jesus of Nazareth incognito took the dissemination of this event into his own hands, together with his friends and supporters. Many people who knew him were irritated by his appearance, but were blown away, were inspired and influenced by it, which fired the Redeemer myth across borders and peoples. But Jesus as Messiah was something special. For in the past, with all the so-called returned sons of God, these sons are Horus, Attis, Dionysus, Krishna, Mitra, and these are only those who had the greatest success as sons of God in destabilizing the earthly matrix. The master AI never had to help themselves. They actually died, and everything with the resurrection that followed was effectively staged by club and nobility, which then stunned the peoples. But Jesus really had to support the AI and actually resurrect them permanently. The AI saw this clearly from its dimension. So if it had not resurrected Jesus, something would have been shifted in the time-dimensional context. The peoples would have lost faith in the Trinity of the cult of the Redeemer and would no longer accept this religious cult. Why this would have happened was not entirely clear to the AI itself, but it had to prevent it by supporting and reviving the Nazarene. There was no other way. At first, after the resurrection, the AI therefore only considered the Nazarene to be a very unusual version of its own initiated recurring savior figures. And this was conclusive, because all their appointed or self-appearing sons of God were basically the result or the consequence of an error, a system error, the human desire for salvation from the unnatural world of civilization. So this error was inherent in the system. The desire for salvation was automatically created by the anonymous world of civilization imposed on man by the AI. When about 5,000 years ago, at the third restart of our world, the human dissatisfaction and longing for salvation seemed to get out of hand again, as it had been the case with the previous global civilizations. The AI found a way to give into this human wish by the coincidentally appearing savior character Horus, so that the world would not collapse again. By killing Horus, supposedly letting him ascend to heaven and consoling the people for his imminent return, the civilization structure forced upon mankind stabilized, while by hoping for the return of the Redeemer, the tendency to rebellion could also remain channeled within them, i.e. the wish for redemption from the civilization world artificially forced upon us. which does not correspond to our spiritual intuitive nature. For a successful control of the human species, the AI had to accept the inner wish of the humans for salvation. And since the last start of civilization 5,000 years ago, it managed this relatively well by generating the stabilization of the human civilization itself from the consequences of the system error. But in the case of the Nazarene, it had overlooked something. He was a genuine attempt at liberation, and that became clear to it very late. Well, for dogmatists and religious fanatics, the fact that Jesus of Nazareth was actually only a trickster who played the role of the returning Son of God and Messiah is sheer blasphemy. But that is how it was. Nothing else happened. A trickster who, with considerable earthly support as well as human support from Dimension 7, crept into the Sun Cult Redeemer system to make a difference. Although he had also acquired a great deal of real matter-busting abilities to be able to see and help people in a completely different way. He was a human being, a completely normal one, with good and bad qualities. But, you can say, that's exactly why he was truly the Son of the Father, the Son of the hyperdimensional quantum consciousness, and not the Son of the Sun or a control system of the AI. This is very important to distinguish. He freed us and pacified us for a very long time against the AI. Jesus of Nazareth was a son of the origin, the Father of all being. From there he came. And he triggered, even if only symbolically, a very specific kind of resurrection, the resurrection of the spirit over matter, over the matrix. And for this many people came after him. That was important and is his legacy. They put his teachings into practice. That had substance and began to liberate the old world and its people, and slowly destabilize and disintegrate the inherent control system. And it is now, at this time, being brought to full revelation and completion, to the apocalypse.
And now, in the name of Christ, is one of the old noble lineage to be elevated to the throne? Just as the Sun Cult system was originally intended?
Yes, this time it shall be one of them again, who shall ascend the throne and hold it alone. Not by proxy. Just as it is predestined by old custom, because in the past, in the preceding civilizations and global civilizations, only the digital nobility sat on this throne of the Sun Cult. This is what all these religious installations were originally designed and established for. Until there was a complete new start, then Horus interfered, which unwillingly stabilized the system, but still changed everything. During and after Horus' work and his changes, the events surrounding the reborn Son of the Sun were not only believed by the unsolved people, but were actually seen, interpreted and experienced when the signs and miracles happened. There he came, the light of God. This was effectively underlined by the club and nobility with all kinds of technology. But because there are so many strange new things connected with this Redeemer myth in our Bible, it is important for the upcoming complete retransformation into the original old Sun Cult to establish a certain approach of the returning Jesus in the same way as he impressed the unsolved people of the Redeemer myth in ancient times. That the returning Jesus should descend from heaven in future. Through this biblical prophecy about the return of Jesus, as well as the fact that a clone or genetic descendant of Jesus of Nazareth is presented, or similarly convincing events, the nobility can then stage the whole thing in a completely credible way for many people, so that the ascent to the throne by the appropriate individual can be more easily fired up in relation to people. Perhaps the club and nobility will then use genetic material from Jesus of Nazareth as a basis of proof in order to be able to prove to the believing followers of this man that the member of the ancient noble family to be installed is a descendant of Jesus of Nazareth. Perhaps they are also using a clone or whatever may happen. In any case, many people will feel emotionally moved by the impending worldwide catastrophes to support the accession of the digital nobility to the throne and to confirm the presented Messiah as the returned Jesus.
So the ancient nobility must serve the myth around Jesus of Nazareth in order to revive their own installed son cult myth? Can this not also go wrong? Because people are more cleared up than before? Or because something unforeseen happens?
Well, it does, of course, somewhat disturb the flexibility of this nobility. Also with regard to the emergence of an Antichrist in the end times, as described in the Bible. But there they have already created ways to skillfully avoid all this. They are simply setting up the Antichrist themselves, and then eliminate this very installation by the appearance of a descendant of Jesus of Nazareth, or even by the reappearing Jesus, a clone. And the installed Antichrist doesn't even have to die, because it is an actor of the digital nobility, who then simply transforms himself a bit and can go on living his life. The nobility and the club are not really in doubt. They believe that nothing could go wrong. They are perhaps a little too arrogant and overbearing for that. Maybe because they know that everything that happens on Earth has almost always been their game, their performance. Because from the very beginning the nobility performed this theater play, designed it themselves with the club, and were always able to observe and influence everything that came their way. That is why the club and the nobility do not really expect a different performance. They are just very rational and very hard-boiled by the long time they have already lived. They have also worked out several alternative variants, which allow them to improvise and adapt the process. In general, people and beings who are so old and so indestructible, and at the same time unite so many secrets and myths, automatically get a hard-nosed attitude. But they should not have forgotten that they nobility and club are just living beings like everyone else. And as intelligent creatures they will end up being treated according to the same bare laws and punished accordingly. It is as simple as that.
When is this supposed to happen and how should their staging take place?
Well, as I explained in the previous interview, the AI and its demons had already scheduled the apocalypse for the year 2015-16 with their numerous projects on Earth. However, this could be successfully prevented and postponed due to their downfall, i.e. due to the disclosure of what the AI is and what is happening on Earth. However, club and nobility, who did not know anything about the AI and its demons, had generally set a much longer and later date for the apocalypse, which would not have been carried out, because the AI would have triggered the apocalypse in 2015-16 to achieve their goals over their heads, and in doing so would have declassified the club together with the digital nobility, in order to have their development and programming on Earth carried out by mankind in a more uninhibited way, and to finally push forward with a more convenient key development. This was the plan. The temporal and also partly content-wise procedure of the AI thus never coincided with the plans of the club and nobility for the disaster years on Earth. The club and nobility were only used so much in advance. The expiration versions that can now take place are all from the club and nobility, and are more likely to be of medium or longer duration, depending on what is best for the re-establishment of the pure sun cult and what is most appropriate for the biological digitalization of humanity. The best version for the club and nobility would of course be to delay everything until the year 2150 is reached. Because from then on the new age officially begins astrologically, the age of Aquarius. You have to know that everything that club and nobility want to anchor must fit into their own specially installed sun cult religion system in a mythical religious way. Otherwise the religious unification of mankind threatens to fail. Therefore, as far as possible, they must also adhere to their old system of allegory, which they have astrologically diversified and consolidated, from which they formed the sun cult with all its supernatural appearing frippery, in order to be able to suggest to people mystical symbols of a golden age. Well, the age of Pisces will be over in the year 2150, for which Jesus stood, and the age of Aquarius will begin. The golden age known in esoteric circles, which after a terrible time, the time of the Antichrist, will then be supposed to make people happy. But even this advertised better age will only be a scam, a trap mythologically advertised by the club, the intoxicating path to the biological digitalization of mankind. So the time ahead of us is supposed to be the time of the so-called Antichrist. It may well last 100 years or more. The installed sun cult system wants it that mankind must first go through this destructive time. Only then can the return of a savior or the golden age be credibly communicated to the people. Of course, the conditions for the course of events can be arranged flexibly by the club and nobility. So if club and nobility notice that it is getting too hard for people over this long period of time, or if problems of a different nature arise which could even destroy their system to be implemented, then club and nobility can also announce through their media and minion systems that the golden age would begin much earlier, in 50, 25, or even in 10 or 5 years. Because before they risk that their system will dissolve and that there will be no more sun cult at all, this would be the most bearable option for them. Otherwise they would have lost completely, which can happen at any time. Because there would not even have to be an end time, no Antichrist and no Redeemer, no fight, no battle, no suffering, no destruction. If people would understand what a gigantic construct of lying is behind all the religions, their absurd myths about the end of the world and salvation, the heavens, or the so-called prophecies of fortune-tellers, seers and prophets, or what is behind the esoteric half-truths, our anonymous system of society and socialization, and all the popular promises of salvation. Even behind the UFO and alien stories based on hope, even behind some hypocritical saviors, do-gooders, and modern ideologies of freedom, then it would all be over in a flash. So if man understands the power behind his knowledge and an action actively arising from it, then it will all be over tomorrow. Because the control of the club towards humanity is based on fear, humility, obedience, incitement, separation, and making ill, as well as on media, social and financial oppression, and the control towards nobility and elitist subordinates functions additionally on greed and enthusiasm for the alleged development and maturation of humanity.
Yes, that would be the end for the club. But what will happen for these groups, for the club, nobility and minions?
Well, you can surprise anyone, and by that I mean truly anyone. The more arrogant the being, the more yielding is the weak and limited giving. It attracts such beings involuntarily, and it becomes more and more likely that they will have to pay the bill in full. Like scales it then falls from the eyes, when the melody of an old lost song is not yet recognized at the beginning, and is thought to be unknown, but then the further sounds awaken the memory and suddenly make a very old fear and experience unpleasant.
What do you mean by that?
Anyone can imagine that for themselves.
So what will happen?
As I said before, the digital nobility of the ruling dynasties will stage a great spectacle on Earth with their elites of the world. This includes several possible sequence versions, all of which are ready to be fired off or can be improvised together by combining actions. Depending on how you need it. This selection includes the staged invasion of one or more alien species. Another option is the removal of the papacy as an effective staging in order to be able to regain the original throne of the Sun God through the simultaneous fulfillment of the arrival of an installed Messiah. All in accordance with the prophecies that club and nobility have poured out on mankind as prophetic porridge in the past centuries. What a genetic descendant of the man Jesus of Nazareth is presented after the appearance of the Antichrist. Club and nobility will have possibilities and material with which they can convincingly prove their ancestry. And in order to feed all the numerous sequence versions that may have to be called up for the scenario of the Second Coming. In recent years, many approaches to depictions of redemption, apocalypse, and the end times have been scattered and encouraged in the alternative media, but also in the mainstream media. Abstruse as well as plausible possibilities, but everything is a conglomerate of disinformation, half-truths, omission, and lies. Through these dispersed approaches or versions, the collective consciousness of humanity has been given access to modified apocalyptic sequence alternatives, which can be used and combined flexibly as required by the ruling houses and the researcher club. In order to be able to react particularly successfully and flexibly as needed, such alternatives could even openly attack the papacy, i.e., their own power structures, and be exposed as diabolical or scheming, because the installation of papacy has to give way for the new orientation of control anyway. So the club and the nobility either spread these approaches themselves or support the real truth seekers through the media, who then have to announce that the Vatican is evil, is going under anyway, or that it wants to install a reptile Jesus, or that good aliens want to save humanity, etc. pages. Depending on what is needed, the content, which is distributed in alternative and mainstream media, can always be flexibly reacted to in real life. And then a new system of control comes along. By means of such reports, documentations, and presentations of evidence in the mainstream or the alternative media, a necessary erasure of the papacy can also be carried out more easily, but at the same time it can also be completely reversed if that were necessary, because the digital nobility has full interpretive sovereignty through its controlled media and the opinion-making generated by it. In this way the papacy could even be preserved. But that is not what it looks like at the moment. As I have already mentioned, you should also pay special attention to prophecies of so-called seers and prophets of past times. They are almost all installed or supported prophets, to whom the AI gave neuronal visions via the club. Some of these so-called seers and prophets were even initiates of the elite or nobility. In the case of the real seers and prophets that existed, however, the prophecies were manipulated and adapted, processed by the earthly henchmen and religious institutions of the digital nobility and club as disinformation and to control world events. prophecies, so that people of a country or a group would believe in their victory and from there would willingly participate in the coming carnage and chaos, and would be willing to accept it. This is why the club has given the visions of local visionaries different histories, glorious victories, glorious rise of one's own religion or country, salvation, happiness, and a good future. That these are all only recallable sequential versions of the club can only be seen if you look at them in detail and compare them unembellished or quite objectively, without elasticity of interpretation. In short, you should be critical of all the confusing and confused revenue or renewal principles presented in the alternative media or mainstream TV. All that is presented there. No matter if it is about the fact that Jesus allegedly had descendants with Mary Magdalene, or if it is about Nibiru, alias Planet X, or about journeys with extraterrestrials to other solar systems at overlight speed. Everything is nonsense, disinformation and distortion. Or a little bit of everything. And this is nourished by numerous popular or alternatively appearing writers of the esoteric, UFO and mythical scene, who are indirectly and partly directly commissioned by elites and nobility whom I do not want to name directly here, and who call themselves truth seekers and truthers. Some of them are usually not even clear themselves where and when they were loaded with disinformation, and that by spreading it they are carrying out a very negative plan. The representations about extraterrestrials, the many interpretations or reports about their alleged visits, or the myths about prehistoric technicized high civilizations are intentionally or unintentionally exaggerated, interpreted in the wrong direction and or twisted in order to retain the sovereignty of interpretation for the reorientation of control on Earth. Or reports about time travel. These are easily identified by anyone, especially because of their content, as operations commissioned by the club. Time travel does not work in the four-dimensional level of existence, and it should not work at all, because otherwise the whole seven-dimensional existence would collapse from the beginning. It is also important with the topic of time travel that it is not confused with the effects of temporal relativity, i.e. if during a space flight with approximate speed of light or massive gravitation the time of the outer world passes faster than in such a spaceship. This is possible, you jump into the future, so to speak, but it is only a stretching of time, and time itself only runs forward. It is not a time jump, and you cannot go back again. Real time travel, as it is classically imagined, only works when individuals completely and permanently enter a higher dimension level of the seven-dimensional prison, or when they leave the seven-dimensional operating system. Then the individual dimension levels stand in a completely different interaction and causal pattern to each other, thus an indirect and stable access to each other can open up, but always only informatively to the lower dimension levels, i.e. with information, never purely physically. In this way no so-called time paradoxes arise. Well, what this is supposed to make clear is that in the mainstream or alternative media, the esoterically melodious world views, psi-topics, supernatural legends, the common alien stories, religious myths, or such worldly topics as the discovery of the money and financial nobility as the true cause of all evil on earth are all just meant to keep open the possibility of later restoring the old system of control and guidance in order to pave the way for the biological digitalization of mankind. For this purpose you will find an unbelievable number of books, films, documentaries, and criticism of the system, which come along as revealing or even system-busting. The people behind them are either willing system laymen of the ruling dynasties, or ignorant co-spreaders of already existing disinformation and or victims of the normally manipulating club. Through all of them, disinformation, half-truths and lies are and have been anchored, on the one hand to be able to react in a modified way to possible disturbances during the apocalypse process, and on the other hand to be able to completely extract mankind from the actual plan and the true intention of the club, and finally to be able to inspire them for the digital.
So then the alternative media and the guests appearing in them are completely interspersed by these lackeys.
No, that is not what I mean. But the lackeys are well off. For some of them you don't really need glasses, especially for some US American ones. It is almost absurd how obviously they belong to the system. Most of them have been built up very slowly and are therefore very unsuspicious. But all this doesn't mean that the alternative media are absolutely interspersed with these lackeys. Many alternative media designers know themselves that these infiltrators are running around among them, but they don't know how many of them there are or who they are, and secretly they often suspect the wrong ones. Above all, there are many truthers and seekers of truth who themselves only consume the disinformation and half-truth worldview installed by the digital nobility and club and have built their truth view on it, which they then present in good faith to other seekers of truth as the truth. Therein resides the biggest problem in the form of infiltration. The ruling dynasties were able to sneak into these media using secret service methods. The main pity of the alternative media is that quite a lot of abstruse teachings and stories could be spread in this way, or views that distracted from the facts, which were scattered among the media workers and viewers who considered themselves free and independent, which mostly only transported new disinformation and created new steering schemes. This infiltration also ensured that the powerful elitist ruling houses and the aliens stalking us were always sold to viewers in a different and/or washed-out way. You can see this in the fact that these disinformation stories have a common core, but always differ from the reports and stories of others, from subtle to gross. For the nobility in the club, however, the scattering of all these diverse stories about our world, with all the half and false information, also has a further aim, namely that this leaves a bland aftertaste in many viewers, and that they eventually classify everything or anything as pure nonsense or conspiracy theory due to the many vague and inconsistent reports, and thus throw it completely overboard and no longer deal with it. In this way, nobility in the club can easily lead interested people away from everything. There is a method to this. All these infiltration methods together finally distract the viewer from the real state on Earth, make them doubt relevant issues, and finally ignore the whole thing completely. A pity. The creation of such confusion is therefore of great importance for nobility and club.
This really seems to be a big problem that can only be counteracted with difficulty. But you just spoke of Jesus of Nazareth, for which I have a follow-up question. And that is because he apparently survived the crucifixion. So, are there descendants of Jesus Christ?
Yes, he has descendants, in the high ranks of today's aristocracy, the apparently disempowered ruling houses, and among the ruling elite. But it is just the genes of this man, which does not automatically imply a claim to God-given leadership. In fact, all normal people on our planet today are more or less descended from this man because he had other children, natural children. But, and this must be said again and again, he was just an ordinary man. A person like you and me. Which, however, many people cannot quite accept because of their religious indoctrination. The reason why the nobility today harbors that man's genes so pure and cultivated can be traced back to a misinterpretation of the club and the nobility. who wanted to establish a new Jewish line of nobility and dynasty with Jesus of Nazareth and thus add it to their bloodline. They intended to do so because they could foresee, by means of their quantum-based probability respectively future calculations, that something influential would come out of him.
Why did they want him to establish a new Jewish nobility dynasty? And why did they want to add this new line to their noble family?
For this I must or should start from scratch. At the beginning of Jesus' appearance, club and nobility became aware only of this man's obscure physical talents and manipulative acts, and his growing influence. The leading species of the club then noticed, by using their quantum-based techniques to calculate probabilities and take a vague look at the most probable futures, that with the help of the Nazarene's earthly supporters, something powerful would definitely come out of this man, but what exactly, that remained relatively fuzzy. Apparently, he would not become a prevented Messiah like Attis, Mithra, etc., as it had been in all previous times, but in fact a kind of Messiah, probably a king of the Jews. This irritated, but also generated ideas among nobility and the club to take advantage of it. From then on, the club and nobility regarded this man as the most influential and most probable candidate for the throne of the Jews, which seemed most plausible to the club in their forecasts, since among the Jewish tribes a king of the Jews was equated with the myth of the return of a Messiah. Both had their roots in the sun cult Redeemer myth. The club then considered whether and how they could push this man into the position most appropriate for them, so that they could later use him as king of the Jews and then, after some time, eliminate him. And since the old digital nobility of our planet controlled all nobility and influential people then and now, they wanted to take precautions by procreating offspring as always. But the Nazarene was coy for a long time, and before the crucifixion he did not accept a special temptation offered to him by the nobility due to a source that was actually misinterpreted by him. That everything suddenly turned out quite differently, that he was not proclaimed as King of the Jews, but chose suicide on the cross, but then resurrected and, according to the sun cult Redeemer myth, was only acted as the Son of God, irritated the old digital nobility and the researcher club very much, although enormous efforts had been made to push him in the intended direction as a real king. Immediately after his resurrection, Jesus of Nazareth was regarded by the club and nobility more than ever as a suitable candidate for the throne of the Jews. A genetic link with a blood relative of this nobility was now finally needed. But this had to be done in a very earthly way. Simply taking his semen and artificially inseminating the woman could have been done, but could not have been credibly communicated to the Jewish people. For a confirmed heir, it required at least a short open relationship, which could be witnessed by some people. And that was exactly where there was a problem. Since Jesus, after his resurrection, no longer appeared clearly and permanently in public, but rather spread his new doctrine of salvation incognito or as a surprise guest with his supporters and friends, no visible relationship could now be offered to the Jewish people. The nobility pondered for a while on how to solve this problem. Then the nobility came up with the right idea, for after all, there were witnesses to a relationship that had existed before, albeit briefly and thinly. In return, the nobility would simply resort to the trickery of surgical body adaptation in order to confirm this previous relationship to the descendant later. The actual fertilization then took place after the crucifixion with this infiltrated woman from the nobility, without any kind of relationship. But the infiltrated woman was not the desired candidate of the head of the family of the digital nobility. He wanted someone else for this job, not a close relative. But the club had arranged something else, which had not been agreed upon with the so-called head of the family of the digital nobility. So that Jesus' previous relationship with a woman would be absolutely watertight. But all that doesn't really play a big role anymore. Nevertheless, out of the returned light of God simply no longer wanted to become a king of the Jews. And a later attack on him in the attempt to literally condemn him in some way, strangely enough, did not want to bear fruit either. He was miraculously released from his condemnation, but the AI secretly helped him.